Most people don't fail from lack of ability. They fail because they live without a clear direction. They have ideas, they have desires, and they have intention to improve, but they don't have firm principles that order their decisions. They start many processes and abandon just as many, not because they can't, but because their life lacks a structure that sustains effort over time. Many people confuse movement with advance. They keep busy, fill their days with activities and responsibilities, but don't build real results. Tiredness accumulates, frustration appears, and the feeling arises of repeating the same days with different circumstances. It's not lack of will, it's lack of direction. Success is not an isolated event or a consequence of chance. It's the result of decisions repeated with constancy, decisions that respond to clear principles and not to the mood of the moment. When a person doesn't live under principles, each day becomes an improvisation, and improvisation sustained over time always leads to stagnation. Changing your life doesn't require doing everything anew. It requires ordering the way you think, decide, and act. It requires stopping reacting to everything and starting to act with intention. When there are no principles, the mind disperses, priorities confuse, and energy wastes. When principles are clear, even the difficult becomes manageable. This audiobook doesn't seek to motivate you for a moment or offer you pleasant phrases. It seeks to help you establish a firm base on which to build real results. During the next 15 days, you'll hear principles designed to help you think with greater clarity, make more conscious decisions, and sustain actions even when it's uncomfortable to do so. Each principle you'll hear has a clear purpose, to force you to assume responsibility over your life, not from external pressure, but from the internal decision to stop postponing the important. Here it's not about doing more things, but about doing the correct ones with constancy. Many people wait to feel ready to change, but change doesn't begin when you feel prepared. It begins when you decide to act despite initial discomfort. The principles you'll hear don't eliminate obstacles, but give you a structure to traverse them without losing direction. That's why I want you to do something simple and powerful. In the comments, write a clear commitment to yourself. During these 15 days, I will act with discipline, even though I don't feel like it. This will be a way of leaving record that you're willing to apply what you hear and sustain it over time. This is a starting point. The decision to live with clear principles and force yourself to have success. Day 1. Principle of clarity of direction. Many people feel their life doesn't advance, but don't know how to explain with exactness why. They work, fulfill responsibilities, and keep busy throughout the day. But at the end of the week, the month, or even the year, results don't change. The feeling that appears is confusing and wearing, doing a lot and achieving little. In most cases, this stagnation is not due to lack of ability or effort, but to the absence of a clear direction that orders decisions. When a person doesn't have clarity about where they're going, their energy disperses without them noticing. They start the day reacting to what appears first, to what interrupts, to what seems urgent. They attend to problems, respond to external demands, and fulfill commitments, but leave aside what really builds progress. This pattern repeats and ends up exhausting, not because the person isn't strong, but because they live making decisions without a structure that sustains them. Lack of direction doesn't always show from outside. Many times life seems to be in order, but internally there's confusion. Poorly defined goals, constantly changing priorities, and postponed decisions create a permanent mental load. Thinking becomes heavy, choosing becomes tiring, advancing becomes uncertain without clarity. Even good intentions lose force over time. This is a fundamental point. Without a clear direction, any path seems valid, and any distraction seems reasonable. That's why many people begin projects with enthusiasm and abandon them when discomfort appears. It's not lack of discipline. It's lack of a direction clear enough to sustain effort when desire disappears. Having clarity of direction doesn't mean having life resolved. It means knowing what you're building, and WHY IT means establishing a central axis that functions as reference for your decisions. When that axis exists, choices simplify. You know what to accept and what to reject. You know where to invest your time and where not. You know what deserves your energy and what only consumes it. A life without direction adapts to everything. A life with direction decides with intention. That's the difference. People who advance don't do more things than others. They do fewer, but do them aligned with defined purpose. That's why their effort accumulates and produces results, while disordered effort dissolves. Applying this principle demands honesty. It requires stopping and observing with clarity how you're using your time, your attention, and your energy. Asking yourself if what you do each day brings you closer or takes you further from what you say you want, not from guilt, but from responsibility. Because while you don't define a direction, your life will continue being directed by circumstances. An essential practice for this first day is concrete and direct. Define with clarity a single main direction for this stage of your life. Not an endless list of desires, but a central course. Write it with simple and clear words. Then observe your daily decisions. Ask yourself if what you do is aligned with that direction, or if you're just reacting to the moment. This question, repeated with constancy, starts to order your life in a real way. Another key aspect of this principle is learning to differentiate the urgent from the important. The urgent shouts, interrupts, and demands immediate response. The important builds results, but doesn't always pressure. Without direction, the urgent always wins. With direction, the important starts to have space. This adjustment completely changes the way you advance. Clarity of direction doesn't eliminate obstacles or make the path easier. What it does is avoid you losing energy doubting, changing course, or constantly starting over. When you know where you're going, even errors become useful learnings and not failures that stop you. This first day is not about demanding immediate results. It's about establishing the base, stopping improvising life, and starting to direct it with intention. Because while you don't have clarity of direction, any effort will be unstable. But when you define a clear course and decide to sustain it, advance stops being a constant struggle and starts becoming a consequence. This is the real beginning of change. Giving direction before demanding results. Day 2. Principle of sustained discipline. Many people believe their life's problem is lack of motivation. They think if they felt more inspired, more animated, or with more energy, they'd advance with greater ease. But reality is different. Motivation is unstable by nature. It appears and disappears according to mood, circumstances, and immediate results. Building a life based on motivation is building on unstable ground. Sustained discipline doesn't depend on how you feel. It depends on what you've decided. It's the capacity to act even when there's no desire, when there's no enthusiasm, and when effort becomes uncomfortable. People who achieve consistent results are not the most motivated, but the most disciplined. Not because they're stronger, but because they've learned not to negotiate with what they know they must do. When there's no discipline, each day becomes an internal discussion. Reasonable excuses appear, convincing justifications, and constant postponements. Nothing seems serious by itself, but that habit of giving weakens personal confidence. Little by little, the person stops believing themselves. They say they're going to do something and don't do it. They promise themselves changes and don't sustain them. That internal incoherence generates wear and stagnation. Sustained discipline eliminates that mental friction, not because it makes things easy, but because it reduces the quantity of unnecessary decisions. When you decide beforehand what you're going to do, you don't need to debate it each day. You act because it's already decided. This structure frees mental energy and allows advancing with greater clarity. A common error is thinking discipline is extreme rigidity. In reality, it's commitment to the essential. It's not about controlling each minute of your life, but about sustaining certain key actions constantly. Actions that repeated over time produce cumulative results. Discipline doesn't demand perfection. It demands continuity. Another important point is understanding discipline is built from the small. Trying to change everything at once usually leads to abandonment. Body and mind resist abrupt changes. Instead, when you establish simple but non-negotiable actions, discipline starts to strengthen naturally. Fulfilling the basic each day creates a sensation of control that reinforces commitment. An essential practice for this day is to define a daily action that's aligned with your main direction and commit to fulfilling it without excuses. Not a heroic action, but a concrete, achievable action, something you can sustain even on difficult days. The key is not intensity, it's constancy. Doing it every day without depending on mood. It's also important to recognize discipline doesn't feel good at the beginning. Many times it feels heavy, uncomfortable, and even unfair. But that discomfort is temporary. Over time, Discipline stops feeling like an imposition and starts feeling like identity. You no longer do things because you force yourself, but because that's the way you live. A life without discipline becomes reactive. It adapts to circumstances, but doesn't direct them. A life with discipline starts to build stability. Decisions stop depending on the moment and begin to respond to a clear criterion. That stability is the base on which real success is built. This principle also implies accepting there will be days when you won't see immediate results. Discipline doesn't always offer quick rewards. Its value is in the cumulative effect. Each sustained action strengthens the next. Each fulfilled day reinforces your capacity to fulfill. That's how personal confidence is built, not with words, but with repeated facts. This second day doesn't seek to demand more than necessary from you. It seeks to help you close the gap between what you decide and what you do, because while that gap exists, advance will be unstable. But when discipline becomes part of your life, progress stops depending on motivation and starts depending on your commitment. This is today's adjustment, sustaining what's decided, even when it's not comfortable. Day 3, principal control of daily decisions. Many people believe their results depend on big decisions made in important moments. They think success is defined by a drastic change, a unique opportunity, or a determinate choice. However, most results a person obtains don't come from extraordinary decisions, but from small decisions repeated every day. That's where the course of a life is really defined. When control over daily decisions doesn't exist, life becomes reactive. You decide according to tiredness, mood, or environmental pressure. You choose the comfortable over the necessary, the immediate over the important. This pattern is not always noticed at first, but over time generates an increasingly greater distance between what a person wants and what they're really building. The problem is not deciding badly from time to time. The problem is deciding without consciousness constantly. Each automatic decision made without reflection goes molding habits that end up defining results. Eating without thinking, working without focus, resting without order, and postponing without limits seem like minor actions, but accumulated they create a life without clear direction. Controlling daily decisions doesn't mean living under permanent tension. It means recovering government of your conduct, choosing with intention instead of reacting by impulse, deciding beforehand what type of person you need to be to sustain the direction you chose, and acting in coherence with that, even when nobody is observing. One of the reasons many people feel exhausted is because they make too many irrelevant decisions. They spend mental energy deciding things that don't matter and leave in the background the decisions that do build progress. When there are no clear criteria, everything seems important and everything tires. Control begins when you establish simple rules for your day-to-day. This principle is based on something fundamental. Not all decisions have the same weight. Some define the course, and others only occupy mental space. Learning to identify which deserve attention and which don't is a key skill to advance. People who progress don't think more than others. They think better because they filter. An essential practice of this day is to reduce unnecessary decisions to minimum. Establishing basic routines for the daily frees mental energy for what really matters. When you automate the simple, you can focus your attention on the important. This doesn't limit your freedom. It strengthens it because you reduce constant improvisation. Another key aspect is learning to decide even when there's no total clarity. Waiting for the perfect moment to decide is usually a disguised form of postponement. In most cases, advancing with a reasonable decision is better than staying paralyzed waiting for absolute certainties. Control doesn't imply having all the answers. It implies assuming responsibility for the decisions you make. It's also important to understand each daily decision reinforces an identity. When you choose to fulfill, you reinforce the image of someone reliable to themselves. When you choose to postpone, you reinforce the opposite. Over time, that identity consolidates and conditions future decisions. That's why daily control is so powerful. It not only defines results, it defines who you become. Many people underestimate the impact of small, poorly managed decisions because they don't generate immediate consequences. But the cumulative effect is implacable. What today seems insignificant tomorrow becomes habit. And habits sustained over time determine the course of a life. This third day is not about changing everything. It's about observing with attention how you decide. Identify in what moments you react without thinking and starting to introduce intention. Stopping a few seconds before choosing. Asking yourself if that decision brings you closer or takes you further from the direction you defined. That small space between stimulus and response is where control is built. When you recover control of your daily decisions, you recover authority over your life. You stop feeling the day drags you and start directing it with criterion, not because everything is easy, but because you no longer choose from impulse, but from intention. This is today's adjustment, deciding with consciousness what you before decided by habit. Day 4, principle of total responsibility. Many people seek to advance, but at the same time preserve the habit of justifying their results. They point to external factors, circumstances, lack of time, lack of support, or past errors. They don't always do it consciously. Sometimes it's a silent habit that appears when things don't go as expected. The problem is that while a dominant external explanation exists, the capacity for change weakens. Assuming total responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything. It means recognizing with honesty what's under your control and what isn't, and stopping giving your power to that which you can't manage. When a person lives blaming the environment, other people, or luck, their margin of action reduces. They wait for something to change outside to be able to advance. And while they wait, they stagnate. Total responsibility changes that focus. It places a starting point inside you, not because everything depends on you, but because your response does depend on you. You may not control what occurs, but you can control how you decide to act facing that. That shift in perspective is one of the most important adjustments in any real improvement process. A life without total responsibility becomes reactive. Each problem is lived as an imposed burden. Each difficulty feels unfair. Each obstacle is interpreted as a signal to stop. Instead, when you assume responsibility, even uncomfortable situations become decision spaces. Not pleasant, but useful. Many people confuse responsibility with excessive pressure. They think taking charge implies demanding more than possible from themselves or living with constant guilt. In reality, responsibility well understood frees because it eliminates the need to justify yourself all the time. It allows you to see things as they are and act accordingly, without drama and without excuses. This principle also implies stopping waiting for permission to advance. Many people live waiting for ideal conditions, more time, more resources, more support. But real progress begins when you decide to advance with what you have from where you are, not because it's ideal, but because it's available. Total responsibility accepts reality and acts from there. An essential practice for this day is to review your current results without looking for culprits, observing frankly what decisions brought you here, not to reproach yourself, but to learn. While you don't identify your participation in your own results, positive or negative, change will continue being superficial. Another key aspect is assuming responsibility over your time. Time doesn't get lost, it gets assigned. Each hour reflects a choice. When you say you don't have time, you're really saying other things have priority. Total responsibility forces you to recognize that and decide if those priorities are aligned with the life you say you want to build. Assuming responsibility also strengthens personal confidence. When you know your decisions matter, you start to care for them more. You become more conscious of your acts and less dependent on external factors. That sensation of internal control is one of the most solid bases of sustained success. This principle doesn't promise comfort. It promises clarity. It places you before your decisions without adornments or justifications. But that clarity is necessary because while you continue explaining your results from outside, your capacity to influence them will be limited. When you take charge, you recover power. The fourth day is not about carrying everything. It's about stopping giving your power to circumstances, recognizing that even in difficult situations, there's always a margin of decision, and that margin well used is enough to start changing course. This is today's adjustment. Assuming responsibility without excuses and acting from there. Day 5. Principle of sustained focus. One of the greatest obstacles to real progress is not lack of talent or lack of opportunities, but the incapacity to sustain focus over time. Many people know what they should do. They even have moments of clarity and strong starts, but don't manage to stay in the same direction long enough to see real results. They change objective, method, or priority before effort has the opportunity to consolidate. The problem of unfocus is not always evident. Sometimes it disguises itself as curiosity, as constant search for improvements, or as a sensation of always learning something new. But when focus breaks over and over, advance dilutes. Each constant change restarts the process, and living restarting is a silent form of stagnation. When there's no sustained focus, energy fragments. You start one thing, then another more. None sustains long enough. The result is not immediate failure, but an accumulation of inconclusive efforts. Over time, this generates frustration because the person feels they're making effort, but don't see clear fruits, not because they're not doing anything, but because they're not sustaining the correct thing during necessary time. Focus is not momentary intensity, it's continuity. It's not about doing a lot for little time, but about doing the necessary constantly. People who build solid results don't live pursuing each new idea that appears. They choose a direction and commit to sustaining it, even when progress is slow and little visible. A life without focus becomes reactive to distractions. Each external stimulus competes for attention. Each new possibility seems better than the previous. Without clear criterion, everything calls attention and nothing consolidates. Sustained focus, instead, functions as a filter. It doesn't eliminate distractions, but reduces their power to drag you. This principle demands learning to say no, not to everything, but to what's not aligned with your main direction. Saying no to certain opportunities, to certain demands, and to certain distractions is not losing. It's protecting your energy. Many people disperse because they don't want to close doors, but keeping all doors open usually prevents crossing any. One of the reasons focus costs so much is because important results don't always offer immediate rewards. Real progress is usually silent at the beginning. It's not noticed from outside, and sometimes not even felt inside. That point. Many people abandon believing it doesn't work, when in reality, they're about to enter the stage where effort starts to accumulate. Sustained focus also implies accepting monotony. Not all advance feels exciting. Repeating correct actions day after day can seem boring, but it's precisely that repetition that builds mastery. People who manage to stand out don't do different things each day. They do the same thing well for a long time. An essential practice for this day is to review where you're dispersing your attention. Identify how many goals you try to sustain at the same time and which really deserve your main focus. Reducing is not retreating. It's concentrating. When you diminish the number of open fronts, you increase the depth of your effort. Another key aspect is learning to tolerate the discomfort of not changing course at first difficulty. Focus is tested when obstacles, boredom, or slow results appear. That's where many people confuse flexibility with abandonment. Adjusting is valid. Constantly renouncing is not. Sustained focus strengthens personal confidence. Each day you choose to continue, even without immediate signals of success, you reinforce the idea you're capable of sustaining what you decide. That internal coherence is one of the most important bases of real success, because it eliminates the need to seek constant external validation. This principle doesn't seek blind rigidity. It seeks conscious commitment, choosing something important and remaining there long enough for effort to have impact. While you continue changing direction, advance will be superficial. When you sustain focus, progress starts to deepen. This fifth day is an invitation to stop dispersing yourself, to choose with criterion and remain with discipline, because success is not built with brief attempts, but with sustained focus. This is today's adjustment, remaining where you decided to be and letting effort do its work. Day 6. Principle of conscious use of time. Many people feel time is not enough for them. They live with a constant sensation of going hurried, of always being busy, and of arriving at the end of the day tired, but without the tranquility of having advanced in what really matters. They believe their problem is lack of hours, when in reality the problem is how they're using the time they already have. Time doesn't get lost, time gets assigned. Each day, consciously or unconsciously, you decide what you give your hours, your attention, and your energy to. When a person says they don't have time, what they're really saying is other things are occupying that space. This truth usually makes uncomfortable because it forces assuming responsibility over priorities that perhaps aren't aligned with the life one wants to build. A life without control of time becomes reactive. The day starts responding to messages, attending urgencies, and reacting to what others ask. Time goes fragmenting in small interruptions that seem harmless, but together consume great part of the day. In the end, the important remains postponed for tomorrow, and tomorrow the same thing happens again. That's how stagnation is built, not from lack of effort, but from lack of intention. Conscious use of time begins when you stop treating all activities as if they had the same value. Not everything deserves your attention. Not everything requires immediate response. Not everything is urgent. People who advance learn to protect certain spaces of their day, not because they have more time, but because they understand without those spaces progress doesn't occur. Many people confuse being busy with being productive. They fill their agenda with tasks, meetings, and commitments, but don't reserve time for what really generates results. Conscious use of time implies differentiating activity from advance, asking yourself if what you're doing brings you closer to your main direction or only keeps you distracted and busy. This principle also demands learning to set limits. Saying yes to everything is a way of losing control of time. Each time you accept something that's not aligned with your priorities, you're ceding hours you won't recover. Setting limits is not selfishness. It's responsibility, because nobody will protect your time for you. One of the most important practices for this day is to review how you begin your mornings. The beginning of the day marks the rhythm of everything else. When you start reacting, the rest of the day usually follows that pattern. Instead, when you define beforehand a key task that must be done yes, you start to recover control. It's not about doing much, but about doing first what really matters. Another key aspect is understanding time is managed better when decisions are made beforehand. Deciding each day at what time and in what order consumes mental energy. When you establish simple structures, you free attention to execute. Order doesn't limit, it facilitates. It reduces daily friction and avoids tiredness, leading you to choose the easiest instead of the necessary. Conscious use of time also implies accepting not everything can be done. Renouncing certain things is part of the process. Many people frustrate because they want to advance without releasing anything, but real progress demands selection. Choosing implies discarding. And discarding, although uncomfortable, is a way of advancing. Over time, when you start using your hours with intention, an important change occurs. The sensation of running diminishes. Decisions simplify. The day stops feeling like a race and starts feeling like a sequence with sense, not because responsibilities disappear, but because now you know why you do what you do. This principle doesn't seek you control each minute of your life. It seeks you stop giving away your hours to what doesn't build anything, that you start treating your time as a limited and valuable resource, because it is, and the way you use it today defines the results you'll see tomorrow. The sixth day is an invitation to recover authority over your time, to stop living reacting and start living deciding. Because while time escapes you without intention, progress will be accidental. When you use it with consciousness, advance becomes inevitable. This is today's adjustment, assigning your time to what really builds your life. Day 7. Principle of conscious constancy. Many people begin processes with force, decision, and enthusiasm, but few manage to sustain them over time. The problem is usually not the beginning, but continuity. Starting is relatively simple when there's clarity or when desire for change is recent. The difficult appears after, when novelty disappears, and only daily repetition remains. That's where most stop. Conscious constancy is not insisting automatically or repeating actions without reflection. It's sustaining with intention what you know is correct, even when it stops being stimulating. The difference between those who advance and those who stagnate is not in initial intensity, but in the capacity to remain firm when progress becomes silent. One of the most common errors is waiting for each day to feel motivating. That expectation creates a fragile relationship with effort. When mood lowers, action stops. Conscious constancy functions differently. It doesn't depend on enthusiasm. It depends on decision. It's acting because you already decided, not because today you feel like it. When there's no constancy, efforts fragment. Small advances are made that later get lost. The same beginnings repeat over and over. This not only breaks progress, also weakens personal confidence. Each abandonment reinforces the idea you're not capable of sustaining what you start, even when you are. Conscious constancy demands accepting most important results are built in repetition, not in extraordinary moments, but in ordinary actions sustained. People who achieve stability and progress don't live in constant peaks. They live in a continuous line of fulfillment, even when nobody observes them. Another key aspect of this principle is learning to advance without need for immediate validation. Many people abandon because they don't receive quick recognition or because results are not visible at the beginning. Conscious constancy sustains even in the absence of external signals. It's based on internal conviction that what you're doing makes sense, even though it's not yet noticed. This principle also implies learning to manage difficult days. There will be days when tiredness, doubt, or frustration appear with force. Conscious constancy doesn't demand those days disappear. It demands they don't decide for you. Fulfilling on difficult days strengthens more than fulfilling on easy days, because it reinforces the idea your behavior doesn't depend on circumstances. An essential practice for this day is to review how many times you've abandoned processes for lack of immediate results, not to judge yourself, but to understand the pattern. Constancy doesn't fail because the method is incorrect. It usually fails because it's interrupted before time. Identifying this habit is the first step to correct it. Another important point is reducing the expectation of perfection. Many people stop being constant because one day they fail and conclude the process no longer works. Conscious constancy doesn't demand perfection. It demands continuity. An error doesn't invalidate the process. Abandoning it does. Learning to retake, without dramatizing, is part of real progress. Over time, constancy builds identity. You're no longer someone who tries, but someone who fulfills. That identity changes the way you perceive yourself and the way you act. You start to trust yourself more not by words, but by accumulated evidence. Each sustained day reinforces that confidence. Conscious constancy also reduces mental load. When you know you're going to fulfill, you don't need to renegotiate with yourself every day. The decision is already made. This frees energy and reduces emotional wear. Living fulfilling what's decided is lighter than living discussing it all the time. This seventh day is not about doing more. It's about not abandoning what you already decided to sustain, remaining even when progress seems slow, trusting in the process you're building, not because it's comfortable, but because it's coherent with the life you want to achieve. This is today's adjustment, sustaining with consciousness what you decided to begin. Day 8, principle of mastery of environment. Many people try to change their life without changing the environment in which they live. They want to think better, act with more discipline, and sustain new decisions, but continue surrounded by the same stimuli, the same distractions, and the same dynamics as before. This contradiction generates where, because it demands a constant force to resist an environment that pushes in the contrary direction. Environment influences more than most are willing to admit. Not only physical environment, but also mental and social environment. The spaces you inhabit, the people you interact with, and the stimuli you consume daily mold your conduct silently. When environment is not aligned with the direction you want to take, each advance requires excessive effort. Many people believe personal strength consists of resisting any environment, but that idea usually leads to exhaustion. People who progress in a sustained way don't live resisting all the time. They design environments that facilitate correct decisions, not because they're weak, but because they understand how human conduct functions. A disordered environment generates mental disorder. An environment loaded with distractions fragments attention. An environment that normalizes postponement reinforces habits that sabotage progress. This doesn't occur consciously. It occurs by constant exposure. That's why many people feel they lose control without knowing exactly why. Mastering environment doesn't mean isolating yourself from the world or eliminating all stimulus. It means consciously choosing what surrounds you and what doesn't, deciding what enters your space, your time, and your attention. When you don't make the selection, others do it for you, and rarely do they do it thinking of your growth point. One of the first adjustments of this principle is to review your immediate environment, the place where you work, rest, and spend most time. Physical disorder usually reflects internal disorder, not because it's an absolute rule, but because external chaos demands constant attention. Ordering space reduces mental friction and facilitates concentration. Another key aspect is digital environment. The information you consume daily directly influences your way of thinking. Superficial content, constant distractions, and stimuli designed to capture attention weaken focus and discipline. Mastering your digital environment implies deciding what you consume, when and why. Not everything deserves your attention. Social environment also plays a determinant role. The conversations you maintain, the attitudes that normalize, and the group's expectations influence your behavior, not always directly, but constantly. Surrounding yourself with people who reinforce postponement, complaint, or lack of responsibility makes sustaining changes more difficult. Not because they force you, but because they accustom you. Mastering environment doesn't mean rejecting people or living isolated. It means putting clear limits, deciding how far you participate, what you accept and what you don't. Many people retreat not from lack of capacity, but because they don't dare to adjust their environment for fear of making uncomfortable or looking bad. But each limit you don't set becomes a burden that breaks your advance. This principle also implies anticipating. If you know certain situations weaken you, avoid exposing yourself unnecessarily, not as escape, but as strategy. People who progress don't trust constant improvisation. They prepare environment to reduce the probability of failing. An essential practice for this day is to identify what aspect of your current environment are sabotaging your discipline, not from judgment, but from observation. Asking yourself what stimuli distract you, what spaces subtract energy from you, and what dynamics push you to postpone. Then start making small but consistent adjustments. Over time, when environment starts to play in your favor, effort diminishes, not because the path is easier, but because it stops being full of unnecessary obstacles. Correct decisions become more accessible. Self-control stops being a constant battle. Mastery of environment is a form of practical intelligence. It doesn't demand extraordinary force. It demands consciousness, recognizing not everything depends on will, and that structuring environment is a way of taking care of yourself and protecting the process you're building. This 8th day is an invitation to stop fighting against everything and start organizing what surrounds you. Because when environment supports your decisions, progress stops being a constant resistance and starts to flow with greater stability. This is today's adjustment, aligning your environment with the life you decided to build. Day 9. Principle of coherence between thought and action. Many people know exactly what they should do to improve their life. They've read, they've heard, they've reflected, and they've arrived at correct conclusions. However, that clarity doesn't always translate into action. There exists a silent distance between what is thought and what is done, and that distance sustained over time is one of the main causes of personal stagnation. Incoherence doesn't usually appear abruptly. It's built in small daily concessions, decisions that seem harmless, but contradict what you know is correct. Each time you do something different from what you've decided, you reinforce an internal pattern of misalignment. Over time, that misalignment weakens confidence in yourself because you start to perceive a gap between your ideas and your conduct. A life without internal coherence generates wear. Thinking one thing and doing another forces you to constantly justify yourself. Explanations, excuses, and rationalizations appear that consume mental energy, not because the person is weak, but because sustaining internal contradictions demands constant effort. The mind seeks coherence, and when it doesn't find it, discomfort appears. Coherence between thought and action doesn't imply absolute rigidity. It implies conscious alignment. It means your actions reflect to the extent possible what you say you value. When that alignment exists, life simplifies, decisions weigh less, guilt diminishes, clarity increases. Not because everything is easy, but because you're no longer internally divided. Many people believe they must first feel convinced to act. They wait for certainty to be complete before moving. But in practice, coherence is built the other way. First you act, then conviction strengthens. Each aligned action reinforces the idea you're capable of living according to your decisions. Confidence doesn't precede action. It's built from it. This principle also implies stopping tolerating constant self-justification. Explaining yourself why you didn't do something can momentarily relieve discomfort, but doesn't correct the problem. Coherence demands assuming when you didn't act as you decided and correcting without dramatizing, not punishing yourself, but also not normalizing incoherence. One of the reasons many people live misaligned is because they establish principles they're not willing to sustain. They promise themselves too big changes, unrealistic ideals, or demands they can't maintain. When those promises break, coherence weakens. That's why this principle demands honesty when deciding. better sustainable commitments than impossible ideals. An essential practice for this day is to observe with attention where incoherence exists between what you say and what you do, not from criticism, but from clarity. Identify a single area where you can better align your conduct with your decisions, not everything at once. A concrete adjustment. Coherence is built step by step. Another key aspect is understanding each coherent action reinforces your identity. You're not coherent because you repeat it mentally. You're coherent because you act like someone coherent. Over time, that identity consolidates and reduces internal friction. You no longer need to convince yourself. You simply act in congruence with what you decided. Coherence also impacts how others perceive you. People trust more in who acts according to what they say. But more important still, you start to trust yourself more. That internal confidence is one of the most solid bases of sustained success because it eliminates the need for constant validation. This principle doesn't demand perfection. It demands constant correction. There will be days when you fail. The important thing is not avoiding error, but not justifying it or converting it into habit, returning to aligned thought and action each time they separate. That repeated practice strengthens character. The ninth day is not about changing what you think. It's about living according to what you already know, about reducing the distance between your decisions and your conduct, because while that gap exists, advance will be fragile. When it closes, progress becomes stable. This is today's adjustment, acting in coherence with what you decided to build. Day 10. Principle of conscious management of energy. Many people try to change their life concentrating solely on what they do, but ignore how they feel while doing it. It's not about passing emotions, but about the level of energy with which they face each day. Energy is a silent resource that sustains or sabotages any process. When energy is disordered, even the best decisions become difficult to sustain. Conscious management of energy doesn't consist of seeking to be motivated all the time. It consists of intelligently administering that which strengthens you and that which wears you down. Many people live exhausted not because they work too much, but because they distribute their energy without criterion. They demand from themselves the irrelevant and neglect the essential. That imbalance ends up affecting constancy, clarity, and discipline that a life without energy management becomes heavy. Each task seems to cost more than it should. Decisions postpone. Irritability increases, not because the person is incapable, but because they're trying to advance with a weakened internal system. Ignoring energy doesn't eliminate its impact. It only makes it less visible. This principle demands recognizing not all activities consume energy the same way. Some tire physically, others drain mentally, others generate emotional tension. When you don't identify these differences, you treat everything as if it were equal and end up exhausted without understanding why. Conscious management begins with observation. Many people believe resting is wasting time. They see rest as a prize earned only after producing. But when rest is eliminated or improvised, energy becomes unstable. The result is not more productivity, but more wear. Rest is not an unnecessary pause. It's part of a system that allows sustaining effort over time. This principle also implies caring for daily rhythm. Not everything can be done with the same intensity. Pretending to maintain a high level of constant demand usually leads to exhaustion. People who advance in a sustained way understand when to demand and when to recover, not because they're indulgent, but because they know real progress requires continuity, not extreme wear. Energy management is also related to internal dialogue. Constant thoughts of pressure, guilt, or excessive demand consume mental energy silently. It's not noticed immediately, but over time generates emotional tiredness. Learning to observe how you speak to yourself is a fundamental part of this principle, not to soften yourself, but to not sabotage yourself from within. That an essential practice for this day is to identify what activities recharge you and which drain you, not from comfort, but from reality. Some important tasks tire, but are worth it. Others tire and contribute nothing. Differentiating between both allows adjusting energy use without abandoning the necessary. Another key aspect is learning to stop before reaching total exhaustion. Many people only rest when they can't anymore. That pattern generates cycles of wear and forced recovery. Conscious management seeks to prevent, not only repair. Introducing intentional pauses avoids fatigue accumulating and affecting important decisions. Energy is also influenced by environment, alimentación, rest, and movement, not as rigid recipes, but as basic elements. Neglecting them weakens the capacity to sustain any previous principle. It's not about perfection, but about minimum coherence with what you need to function well. When energy is managed consciously, an important change occurs. Tasks stop feeling so heavy. Discipline becomes more accessible. Mental clarity improves. Not because life is easier, but because the internal system is better sustained. This principle doesn't seek you live comfortable. It seeks you live operative, that you have sufficient energy to sustain decisions, fulfill commitments, and advance with stability. Because success doesn't depend only on what you decide, but on if you have necessary energy to sustain those decisions over time. The 10th day is an invitation to care for the resource that makes everything else possible, to stop demanding from yourself without criterion and start administering your energy with intelligence. Because without energy, principles stay in intention. With well-managed energy, progress becomes sustainable. This is today's adjustment, administering your energy to sustain the life you're building. Day 11, principle of tolerance to process. Many people abandon just when the process starts to demand patience. They expect quick results, clear signals of advance, and constant confirmations they're on the correct path. When those signals don't appear immediately, doubt arises, and with doubt the temptation to change course. Not because the process doesn't work, but because they're not willing to tolerate the time it requires. Lack of tolerance to process is one of the most silent causes of failure. It doesn't manifest as laziness or incapacity, but as impatience. They want to advance, but also want advance to be visible and quick. When this doesn't occur, effort starts to feel useless. Many people don't fail because they do things badly, but because they abandon before the process has effect. Every real process has an initial stage in which effort is not reflected in external results. That stage is uncomfortable because it demands confidence without immediate evidence. You work, you adjust, you repeat, but there are no applause or visible changes. For who doesn't tolerate this phase? The process seems stagnant when in reality it's taking form. Tolerance to process is not resignation, it's comprehension. Understanding progress is not always linear or immediate, that there are moments of apparent stillness that in reality are moments of internal consolidation. People who achieve sustained results don't interpret lack of immediate results as failure, but as natural part of the path. When tolerance to process doesn't exist, constant changes are generated. The method is adjusted over and over. You start anew, repeatedly. You confuse flexibility with inconstancy. Each restart erases part of accumulated progress. Thus, although you work a lot, real advance is minimal. This principle demands learning to remain even when progress is not evident, remaining in correct practice, remaining in discipline, remaining in commitment, not from stubbornness, but from comprehension of how real change functions. Deep transformations don't occur from one day to the next. They occur by accumulation. One of the reasons many people don't tolerate process is because they compare their advance with that of others. They observe external results without knowing the time, effort, or adjustments that were behind. That comparison distorts perception and generates impatience. Each process is different, and comparing it only weakens commitment. Tolerance to process also implies accepting discomfort. Real change makes uncomfortable because it breaks habits, challenges beliefs, and demands sustained effort. Wanting to change without discomfort is a contradiction. People who advance don't avoid discomfort. They traverse it with criterion. They don't seek it, but also don't use it as excuse to stop. An essential practice for this day is to review how many times you've abandoned processes for not seeing quick results. Identifying that pattern without judgment, understanding it wasn't lack of capacity, but lack of tolerance. Recognizing this allows adjusting expectation and sustaining process with greater maturity. Another key aspect is learning to measure progress internally, not only externally, observing improvements in discipline, in clarity, in constancy. Those changes usually precede visible results. When only external is valued, real progress that's already occurring is lost from sight. Tolerance to process strengthens character. Each day you choose to continue without immediate evidence, you reinforce your capacity to sustain long-term decisions. That capacity is one of the clearest differences between those who achieve stability and those who live changing course. This principle doesn't promise speed. It promises solidity. It doesn't offer shortcuts. It offers structure. Understanding process and tolerating it is accepting success is not a stroke of luck, but a gradual construction. And all construction requires time. Day 11 is an invitation to stop rushing change, to trust in the process you're building, and to sustain it with active patience. Because while you don't tolerate the time the process needs, any advance will be fragile. When you learn to remain, progress consolidates. This is today's adjustment. Sustaining process without abandoning before time. Day 12. Principle of making difficult decisions. Many people avoid difficult decisions because they associate them with loss, conflict, or discomfort. They prefer to postpone, soften, or seek alternatives that don't demand a clear cut. However, great part of personal stagnation doesn't come from bad decisions, but from important decisions that are never made. Living avoiding the difficult maintains an appearance of calm, but weakens real advance. Difficult decisions are not difficult from lack of clarity. They're difficult because they demand renouncing something, renouncing a comfort, a habit, a relationship, a known way of living. While that renunciation is not assumed, progress is limited, not because path doesn't exist, but because you're not willing to close stages. A life without difficult decisions becomes ambiguous. Everything stays halfway. Nothing is defined completely. Options are kept open for fear of making mistakes. But that constant openness prevents real commitment. When you don't decide, time decides for you and rarely does in your favor. This principle demands understanding deciding doesn't always feel good in the moment. Many correct decisions generate immediate discomfort, but long-term relief. Instead, many comfortable decisions offer immediate relief, but generate long-term burden. People who advance learn to choose according to future effect, not according to present comfort. Avoiding difficult decisions also consumes energy. Maintaining undefined situations demands constant attention. Thinking over and over what to do, what to say, or when to act wears down more than deciding and facing consequences. Clarity, even when uncomfortable, frees more energy than sustained doubt. Making difficult decisions requires assuming not all choices will be perfect. Waiting for absolute certainty is usually an excuse not to decide. In most cases, there's no ideal option. There are reasonable options that must be assumed with responsibility. Progress doesn't depend on always being right. It depends on not being paralyzed. This principle also implies learning to assume consequences without dramatizing. Deciding implies accepting there will be adjustments, errors, and learnings. People who advance don't seek decisions without consequences. They seek decisions worth sustaining. That difference completely changes the relationship with risk. An essential practice for this day is to identify what important decision you've been avoiding for time, not a minor decision, but one you know could free energy, close a cycle, or reorder your life. Observing it with honesty, recognizing what you're avoiding losing, and asking yourself if that cost is greater than that of continuing to postpone. Another key aspect is stopping justifying indecision with excessive analysis. Thinking is necessary, but thinking without limits becomes paralysis. When basic information is already clear, continuing to analyze doesn't contribute, it only delays. Making difficult decisions demands a point of mental closure. Choosing and advancing. Difficult decisions also strengthen character. Each time you choose the correct thing, although it makes uncomfortable, you reinforce your capacity to govern yourself. That capacity accumulates. Over time, decisions stop feeling so heavy, not because they're easy, but because you trust your criterion more. This principle doesn't invite impulsivity. It invites conscious determination, evaluating, deciding, and acting without staying trapped in doubt. Constant indecision wears down more than corrected error. Understanding this frees from fear of making mistakes. Day 12 is an invitation to stop fleeing from the uncomfortable, to recognize many of the decisions you avoid are those that could order your life. While you continue postponing them, progress will be partial. When you decide to face the difficult, advance accelerates. This is today's adjustment, choosing with determination what you've been avoiding deciding. Day 13. Principle of constructed self-confidence. Many people believe confidence in oneself is something you have or don't have. They think it's a personality trait, an innate quality, or the result of past experiences. Under that idea, who doesn't feel confident waits for something external to occur to start acting with security. But real self-confidence doesn't function like that. It doesn't appear before action. It's built from it. Lack of self-confidence doesn't usually come from incapacity, but from sustained incoherence. When a person promises themselves things and doesn't fulfill them, when they decide to advance and then retreat, when they avoid what they know they must face, internal confidence weakens, not because they're not capable, but because their conduct demonstrates the opposite to them over and over. Constructed self-confidence relies on facts, not on positive thoughts. It's not born from repeating to yourself you can, but from verifying you do what you decide. Each fulfilled action, however small, reinforces the idea you can trust yourself. Each avoided or postponed action weakens that internal relationship. Over time, that pattern consolidates and defines how you perceive yourself. Many people try to increase their confidence, changing the way they think, but maintain the same evasion habits. The result is frustrating. The mind doesn't convince itself with words when conduct says the opposite. Confidence is not negotiated with internal speeches. It's won with coherence. This principle demands understanding self-confidence is not absence of doubt. It's capacity to act despite doubt. Confident people are not those who never doubt, but those who don't allow doubt to decide for them. They recognize fear, insecurity, or discomfort, but advance anyway. That repeated experience is what builds real confidence. Another common error is waiting to feel prepared before acting. That wait usually becomes paralysis. In most cases, preparation completes itself in the process, not before beginning it. Self-confidence strengthens when you accept you don't need to feel ready to start. You only need to be willing to correct on the path. This principle also implies stopping constantly comparing yourself. Comparison distorts perception of your own progress. You observe others' results without seeing the process that sustained them. That weakens confidence because it makes you always feel at disadvantage. Constructed self-confidence focuses on your own journey, not on others. An essential practice for this day is to identify small actions you know you can fulfill and commit to doing them without excuses. Not grandiose actions, but concrete and sustainable actions. Fulfilling them reinforces the relationship with yourself. Confidence is built from the basic, not from exaggerated promises. Another key aspect is learning to tolerate error without converting it into identity. Failing doesn't eliminate confidence if corrected. What weakens it is abandoning after error. Mature self-confidence understands making mistakes is part of process, but giving up is not. Trying again strengthens more than getting it right the first time. Constructed self-confidence also reduces the need for external approval. When you trust your capacity to fulfill, opinions lose excessive weight, not because they stop mattering, but because they no longer define your value. That internal independence is one of the most solid bases of sustained success. This principle doesn't seek to inflate your ego. It seeks to stabilize your relationship with yourself, that you can look at yourself with respect because you know you do what you say, even when it costs. That form of confidence is silent, but firm. It doesn't need to be demonstrated. It reflects in conduct. Day 13 is an invitation to rebuild confidence from action, not from expectation. To stop waiting to feel secure to advance, and start advancing to feel secure. Because real self-confidence doesn't appear before the path. It forms walking it. This is today's adjustment. Building confidence, fulfilling what you decide day after day. Day 14. Principle of long-term vision. Many people make decisions thinking solely of immediate relief. They evaluate their actions according to how they feel today, according to what's most comfortable for them now, or according to what avoids discomfort in the short term. This approach can function momentarily, but over time becomes a trap. Living only for the immediate present weakens any project that requires constancy and depth. Long-term vision doesn't consist of living disconnected from the present. It consists of understanding each current decision has a future impact, even when that impact is not immediately visible. People who achieve stability and progress don't make isolated decisions. They think in terms of accumulated consequences. They know what they do today is building something for better or worse. A life without long-term vision becomes reactive. Each problem is resolved urgently. Each opportunity is evaluated without context, and each decision is made as if it were independent. The result is a succession of choices that don't connect with each other. You advance a little and retreat another little. You gain something today and lose tomorrow. There's no real continuity. Long-term vision demands an important mindset change. It requires stopping asking yourself only what suits you now and starting to ask yourself what type of life you're building with your repeated decisions. This question makes uncomfortable because it forces observing patterns, not excuses. It forces recognizing many current situations are the result of past choices sustained over time. Many people avoid thinking long-term because it generates anxiety. They prefer to focus on resolving the immediate, to not face the responsibility of planning. But avoiding future vision doesn't eliminate its effects. The future arrives anyway, only without preparation. People who develop long-term vision don't live anguished by tomorrow. They live more conscious of the present. This principle also implies learning to postpone rewards. Immediate gratification offers quick relief, but rarely builds anything solid. Long-term vision teaches to tolerate waiting, not as empty sacrifice, but as conscious investment. Renouncing something today to build something greater tomorrow is one of the clearest capacities of those who advance with stability. One of the reasons many people frustrate is because they expect quick results from decisions that require time. They plan an action today and want to harvest tomorrow. When that doesn't occur, they abandon. Long-term vision adjusts that expectation. It understands real growth follows different rhythms, and that rushing it usually weakens it. This principle doesn't demand you have a detailed plan for your entire life. It demands coherence between your present decisions and the future you say you want. If you say you want stability but constantly choose the immediate, there's a contradiction. Long-term vision serves to detect those incoherences and correct them in time. An essential practice for this day is to observe your recent decisions and ask yourself what type of future they're building. Not from fear, but from clarity. If you continued exactly like this for a year, what would change? This reflection doesn't seek to punish you. It seeks to give you perspective. Vision strengthens when you consciously connect present with future. Another key aspect is learning to tolerate slow progress. Sustainable growth is rarely spectacular at the beginning. It's silent, constant, and cumulative. Long-term vision allows remaining in that rhythm without frustrating. It helps you understand advancing slowly, but in the correct direction is better than advancing quickly and losing course. Long-term vision also influences how you handle difficulties. When you have a broad perspective, current problems lose part of their emotional weight, not because they stop mattering, but because you see them as part of a bigger process. This perspective reduces impulsivity and improves quality of decisions. This principle doesn't invite living waiting for the future. It invites consciously building it from the present, making decisions today that perhaps don't feel comfortable, but are coherent with the life you want to sustain. Because the future is not improvised, it's built with daily choices. Day 14 is an invitation to leave the logic of short-term, to stop deciding only by immediate relief and start deciding by future coherence. When you adopt this vision, progress stops being erratic and starts having real direction. This is today's adjustment. Deciding today, thinking of the life you want to sustain tomorrow. Day 15. Principle of assumed identity. Many people try to change their life modifying isolated actions, but without changing the way they perceive themselves. They want better results, but continue seeing themselves as the same person as always. This mismatch creates a constant tension because new actions don't sustain when internal identity doesn't back them. Real change doesn't consolidate until the person assumes a new way of seeing themselves and living. Identity is not what you say you are or what you'd like to be. It's what you do consistently. Each repeated decision reinforces an internal image. When you act with discipline, you start to see yourself as someone disciplined. When you sustain difficult decisions, you perceive yourself as someone capable of doing it. When you fulfill what you decide, you reinforce the idea you can trust yourself. That identity is built day after day, not by intention, but by accumulated evidence. During these 15 days, you've worked principles that didn't seek to motivate you, but to order you. You adjusted your direction. You've strengthened discipline. You've taken control of your daily decisions. You've assumed responsibility. You've learned to focus your energy, to sustain processes, to tolerate discomfort, to decide with determination, and to build confidence from action. All this has a final purpose, becoming identity. Because while principles are only temporary practices, change will be fragile. When they integrate into the way you live, change becomes stable. Many people relapse because they live effort as something provisional. They act differently for a time, but internally expect to return to before. That expectation sabotages any advance. Assumed identity functions another way. It doesn't wait for permission to consolidate. It affirms itself through conscious repetition. It doesn't ask if this is definitive. It simply acts in coherence with what it decided to build. Assuming a new identity doesn't mean pretending to be someone different. It means living according to what you already decided to be. If you decide to live with discipline, you act with discipline. If you decide to live with responsibility, you respond for your decisions. Over time, that coherence stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural. Not because it's easy, but because it's congruent with the life you're building. This principle also implies abandoning the mentality of attempt. Attempting leaves open the possibility of abandoning. Assumed identity doesn't attempt, it fulfills. Not because it's perfect, but because it corrects and continues. When you fail, you don't retreat, you adjust. When you doubt, you don't stop, you advance with criterion. That way of acting consolidates the identity that sustains success. Many people don't assume a new identity because they fear not being up to it. They fear failing and confirming to themselves they can't. But identity is not destroyed by an error. It's destroyed by abandoning. Who assumes who they want to be understands making mistakes is part process, but giving up is not. Each correction strengthens more than fragile perfection. Assuming identity also implies stopping defining yourself by the past. What you did before explains where you come from, but doesn't determine where you're going. Identity is built in the present with current decisions. Each day you act in coherence with the principles you've worked. You reinforce that new way of living, independently of what happened before. At this height of the process, you don't need to do anything extraordinary. You don't need to change everything at once or demonstrate anything to anyone. You need to continue doing what you already know works. Returning to these principles when doubt appears, adjusting when necessary, correcting when you fail, continuing when it costs. That constancy is what fixes change. Success doesn't arrive as an isolated event or as a sudden revelation. It's built as a consequence, as a natural result of living with clear principles, conscious decisions, and sustained actions. When identity changes, behavior stops depending on motivation and starts sustaining itself by internal coherence. This last day doesn't mark an ending. It marks a consolidation. The moment when you stop seeing this process as a temporary challenge and start seeing it as a way of living, from here on nobody will force you to sustain it. That responsibility is yours, but it's also your power. Each day you choose to act in coherence. You reinforce the life you're building. The decision now is simple and direct. Continuing living as always, reacting to circumstances, or living under clear principles and sustaining them even when it's not comfortable, not as a promise, but as a way of acting. This is the point where change stops being an idea and starts being a consequence. Living as the person you decided to be.